Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us here today. My name is Anka Gurzu. I'm the Chief Europe Correspondent for Cypher News, and I'll be the moderator for this session. We're here to talk about adaptation financing, and more specifically, the gap that we see between adaptation needs and adaptation financing. It's obviously a very important topic that's becoming increasingly important as we see the destruction around the world caused by hurricanes, floods, and droughts that's only increasing the urgency to create more resilience, especially in developing countries. I'm joined here by distinguished panelists who I will introduce to you now. We have Bo Lee, the Deputy Managing Director at the International Monetary Fund. We have Rania Al-Mashat. She's Egypt's Minister of Planning, Economic Development, and International Cooperation. Andrew Steer, the President and CEO of the Bezos Earth Fund. And Tracy Kajumba, she's the Director of Life AR Interim Secretariat, which is an initiative that's looking at helping least developed countries adapt to climate change, and it is housed within the International Institute for Environment and Development. So as I just said, there's an increasing awareness of the urgent need to adapt, but there's not enough money flowing in that direction. And I just want to turn to what Antonio Guterres, the Secretary General of the UN, said earlier this week on Tuesday during the World Leaders Climate Summit. He pointed out that the gap between adaptation needs and finance needs could reach up to $359 billion a year by 2030. And I'm just going to share this quote from him because I thought it was pretty powerful. He said, "These missing dollars are not abstractions on a balance sheet. They are lives taken, harvests lost, and development denied." And also, Kristalina Georgieva, the head of the IMF, who was speaking on a panel here earlier this week, she said that we need to mitigate and adapt with the same sense of urgency. Obviously, we know one of the main challenges is the difficulty to attract private investment into adaptation financing. So, Bo Lee, I want to start with this big question. Why is it so hard to attract private investment for adaptation financing, and how can we overcome those barriers?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me start by maybe outline the gaps we see. We see a big funding gap, as you already alluded to. Our estimate is that right now the adaptation financing level in 2022 was $63 billion. And our estimate for 2030, the level should reach to $200 billion to $400 billion. So the gap, as you can see, is a big gap. There is also a gap between mitigation and adaptation. What we see is that 75% to 90% of funding goes to mitigation. So there is not enough money for adaptation. And finally, there is a gap between public sector and private sector, because 98% of adaptation financing comes from public sector. So that comes to your question, why is it so hard to attract private capital into adaptation? I think the answer is very simple, because fundamentally, resilience is a public good. So public good, there is a market failure, because we learn Econ 101, we know when there is a public good, there is market failure. And so with a public good, we typically say if there is a market failure, we need government to invest. Of course, there is very limited fiscal space around the globe. Most countries have very limited fiscal space. And that's one reason why we see so little adaptation investment. Another challenge, of course, is that it's very hard to generate cash flow when you have a public good. When there is no cash flow, of course, it's very hard to attract private capital. And finally, there is also insufficient willingness to pay for resilience. For example, if we have resilient agriculture, we produce apple, right? We say, oh, this is climate resilient apple. Who is willing to pay climate resilient apple if it's more expensive than a typical apple, right? So if there are two apples, one is climate resilient, one is not, of course I will buy the cheaper one, the non-resilient apple. So my point is that how can we make consumer pay products that are climate resilient. Sometimes it's hard because, again, this resilience is fundamentally a public good. It's not individualized. And it's hard for a consumer to see, oh, this climate resilient apple is good for me. It's actually good for the humanity, right? So that's a challenge. How can we produce that willingness to pay from consumers? That's a challenge.
Andrew, what's your take on this? We just heard Boli say that because usually adaptation is a public good and it's connected to market failure and there's also insufficient willingness to pay. What's your take on the challenge of bringing private investment in for climate adaptation?
Well, first, congratulations to the IMF holding this. I think it's a sign of great encouragement that, that the leading financiers in the world are taking this issue seriously. It seems to me that the starting point has to be to try and understand what the private sector is and how they think. The private sector needs to have its money come back to it, either in the form of profits or in terms of debt repaid. So there has to be, if you like, a cash flow, and that should be their starting point. Second starting point should be to recognize that actually the private sector actually understands adaptation much better than most of us, because you can't remain a private company for several decades without adapting. The thing is, they adapt to all kinds of other shocks, interest rate rises, recessions, bad harvests, and so on. They're used to adapting to that, but they're not used to adapting to climate change. And so one of those important things is to help the private sector understand the risks of climate change. Now, what we did about 5 years ago, and thanks to Kristalina Georgieva, because she was one of the 3 co-chairs, we set up the Global Commission on Adaptation to try and link adaptation to the economy. And we also asked Ban Ki-moon and we asked Bill Gates, so 3 pretty good chairs of that. And the idea was to try and demonstrate, if it was warranted, the link between adaptation and the economy. And the link is huge, obviously. If we don't adapt, the economy suffers very badly. So too, if you invest in adaptation, the rates of return can be very high. But as Bo Li was saying, the rates of return will accrue to the country as a whole often, not just to the individual investor. The individual investor thinks about how he or she will get the money back. The rates of return accrue to everybody. So here there's a role for government too. I think it's going to be relatively easy over time to get the private sector to make sure it ensures its own investments, if they're building a factory, are resilient. If they have good data on how many hurricanes come, they will build stronger buildings. So too, if they're a food processing organization, they will presumably spend a lot of time thinking through how their farmers are going to do. But much more difficult is to get the private sector to recognize that actually the entire economy upon which they depend is vulnerable to climate change, and therefore governments can play, and so can funds play, a clever role, I think, in ensuring that if you are a private sector and you want to make money in country X, maybe you pay some kind of tax in order to protect yourself down the road so that you can invest in adaptation.
So when the risk is closer to home and they feel the consequences much faster, they're more willing, but we still need to work to enlarge in that perspective, right? And Tracy, I want to bring you here, what's the perspective of the least developed countries here on the ground? You work with them on the ground, so what's their perspective?
Thank you, Anka. For the least developed countries, first of all, before we even go to the private funding, we know that adaptation funding, 98% of it is public funding. And the recent report says LDCs accessed only 5%. So before we go to the complex private sector, even the public sector, they are not even accessing that funding. But to make it worse is that 67% of the funding accessed was in terms of loans, and only 12% is concessional. And it becomes really ridiculous for countries that are not even affording public goods to be able to get loans for adaptation. That is the starting point, I think, for the LDCs, which is complex. And when we go to the private sector, As others have mentioned, private sector is for profit, and adaptation is a public good. And it's long term. That's the other thing. We are looking at profits. We are looking at what we are getting out of it, and we are looking at risk. Private sector will look at risks and definitely will hesitate to invest. But we are looking at adaptation, which is long term. Can private sector invest in the long term within the LDCs where they know they are not going to get profits? And it's risky as well. I think that's something that needs to be worked on, how to manage the risk, to de-risk the investments, if that can happen. Andrew said that private sector is better than everybody on understanding adaptation, and rightly said not climate adaptation. I completely agree with that. We've worked with private sector companies who are involved in agribusiness, value chains, and they don't get it on how to do adaptation. And you're dealing with a value chain, you're on the top of the value chain, but on the lower nodes of the value chain, everything is affected by climate. You have farmers who are working with, depending on rain-fed agriculture. We don't have meteorology systems to have early warning in place, but then there's no investment in that. So how does the business work? I think there's a knowledge gap, there's an expertise gap in private sector to try and link what are the climate risks, how do they affect investments, and how can private sector invest in that? I think that's the other challenge. There has been models of blended finance, which was looking at sort of de-risking the investments, but some of the evaluations done, it's not all bad, but some of the evaluations done also find that focus on issues of inclusion and poor communities don't come in really well. The targeting is also for those that at a certain level have big businesses, but what about the everyday people who are depending on agriculture and small investments? How do we get them into the picture as well, especially as we talk about locally led adaptation? So these are some of the things that we really need to work on together.
Thank you. And based on your answer, I can see there's so many layers to this conversation, especially your point on the access that countries, like how small percentage from the public sources actually reaches countries on the ground. And we're here talking about private, so it's very complex. Minister Rania, you heard now different perspectives on this. What is Egypt's experience with climate adaptation funding, and what are some examples that you can give us?
Well, thank you very much. There's, in the COP language, if I'm sitting with my Minister of Environment, she would say any adaptation has to come from grants. We shouldn't even take concessional loans from the World Bank or African Development Bank for adaptation. So there's an inherent belief in the negotiating space that with adaptation, that these are natural resources, the desertification and so on, and therefore the pocket of grants should be provided. In reality, we want to move ahead when we talk about water waste management projects, when we talk about agriculture, which is very important for food security, when we talk about water desalination. Many of these projects have two components. If I'm talking about water waste management, these are public goods, so there's public investment that comes in. But when it's managed properly, it can provide opportunities for agriculture, that here comes the private sector to actually invest with the farmers, to invest in terms of the value chains for exporting and so forth. So I would like to dissect the question, or dissect the projects, because as you mentioned, adaptation is a very big concept, and we need to dissect it so that we know how much comes from the public investment, how much comes from grants for technical advisory or investment preparation, how much the government needs to do. And if we're looking at the World Bank evolution with respect to public, global public goods, if I'm spending on a public good that benefits Egypt but also benefits the world, and there's an exercise being done with the UN, how can that account for my debt sustainability analysis? So there's many dimensions to this. Our experience has been, we put together a country platform that includes adaptation projects, identified adaptation projects, both on the food side and the water side. and they are linked to some extent with our energy nexus or with our energy projects. But what we've done on the adaptation side is choose a lead MDB to work with us on identifying or making the projects bankable so that we can identify how much we are going to put in either from our money or from a concessional loan, and then the private sector can come in. So there needs to be a structure where we ensure that the private sector can make money and would be willing to come in, but the concessional finance is to de-risk that. So there's no one-size-fits-all. Mitigation is more understood, wind, solar, and so on. On adaptation, as you mentioned in your opening remarks, it's very country-specific, and there needs to be a bigger effort in working together to dissect the issue. In our case, for example, in the country platform, we have projects such as adaptation of Northern Delta affected by sea level rise. So that's one of the projects which comes from concessional finance, but not open to the private sector. Private sector would not necessarily come in to help with sea level rise. But if we're looking at, for instance, improving agriculture climate resilience by modernizing on-farm practices, that is one project where philanthropy or private sector engagement might find it with a certain level of return. So it's quite diverse, and that's why it's important that it's country-led. It's important that all of these are within the national plans as well, so that there is a level of transparency in the communication with the private sector, with the MDBs, and also with the public. I think that's another point which is important. But we are working with the different development partners with respect to putting the investability, making these projects investable, also providing the technical capacity at the local level to be able to push these projects forward.
That's great. And I want to get Boli back in the conversation. We just heard the minister speak about the importance of making this project bankable. And also what I've heard from that answer is the fact that adaptation, you kind of have to take projects one by one. They're all different. They all fit differently in different countries. I wonder what your thoughts are on what other solutions you've heard. You know, you're at the COP here. You probably met with so many people. What other solutions have you heard on how to bring in more money for climate adaptation?
We do see a lot of innovations in this field. I know the challenge is as I described, right? This is a public good challenge, but it's also a $1 trillion challenge. We need a lot of investment in this area. And as far as I can see, there are several areas of innovation or reforms that can be considered when we try to tackle this tremendous challenge. The first one will be policy reform. We can think of legislative reform, regulatory reform that can establish standard of resilience. That means if we establish standard of resilience for industries, for sectors like agriculture, transportation, that means all the projects within those sectors have to meet minimum standard of resilience. That will be like legislative or regulatory standards that will be built into the system. That means everybody has to pay. The higher standard agriculture, the higher standard transportation facility, then that's one way to solve this public good challenge, right? So the willingness to pay will be converted into a obligation to pay because it's legal requirement or it's regulatory requirement. So that's one possibility. The second way to do this, not the second way, the second area that we could work on will be in terms of project design and project preparation. Because there is one example in Barbados, right? Barbados is trying to build a seawall with funding from World Bank. And the question is how can that seawall produce a cash flow to support this World Bank loan, right? The way to do they find a way to do this is to let the hotels, the resorts along the seashore to pay for that wall, to pay an annual fee, because they are the direct beneficiary of that seawall. So if you can identify beneficiary of a specific adaptation project, you can make them pay. So users have to pay a fee for the goods produced by the adaptation projects, right? So that's another potential area that adaptation project could be designed and prepared in a way that can generate cash flow. That's the second area. The third area that we could work on will be in terms of de-risking or risk-sharing arrangement between public sector and private sector, because one of the challenge for adaptation projects, similar to mitigation project, is that how to de-risk for investors. So certain kind of guarantee arrangement, certain kind of first loss capital could help to de-risk for the private sector to come into adaptation projects.
Great, and I really appreciate the concrete examples. I think that helps our audience also understand, and I want to get Tracy's reaction here. So we heard about some solutions, policy reform, project design, and Boli gave the example of the seawall, and he said the willingness to pay kind of becomes an obligation to pay by the users. But then the question I had, in groups of countries like the least developed countries, is there a capacity to pay in situations like that if you have such projects going on?
I think that is really difficult for the LDCs. I already gave the statistics of very limited access to finance. And the reason why LDCs are not getting funding, usually it's like they have no capacity to manage the funds. The funds have to go through intermediaries who will be UN agencies or other big international organizations. And that's what we are trying to address in LifeAR. And what Boli said about reforms, I want to go to that. What is failing the financing to get down is actually the very strict regulations around the funds. Many of the governments try to access funding from multilateral agencies, but they can't meet the requirements. Some of the countries take up to 4 or 5 years trying to get one project into the country, and that is not working. So the power dynamics around access to finance is very, very big, especially for the developing countries. So the LifeAR initiative that I'm working on, the LDCs have come together to challenge the dynamics around power in who gets the money, who manages it, because the levels of intermediation ensures that very little gets to the local level to be invested in adaptation. We did research at IID a few years ago and found that only 10% was getting to the local level. The rest of it will be either national processes, and because communities are not involved in deciding what kind of investments, so it will either be workshops or something. So we are trying to shift that. Can we get at least 70% of adaptation funding to the local level? Can financing be scaled up so that it's not a little funding that is addressing a short-term project, but long-term scaled-up funding that is able to meet the needs of LDCs. But at the moment, the capacity to manage the funding is not there, because due to the power dynamics, LDCs are not accessing the money. It's being controlled somewhere and little going into the countries through different mechanisms. So the challenge is, how do we develop equitable partnerships where governments are able to sit with private sector, to sit with bilateral funders, and really look at the problem? Because the challenge is that we are looking at climate as not seriously, really. It's a global problem. The least developed countries have contributed very little to it, but experiencing the same impacts. So can we look at it as a partnership on what can LDCs contribute? What is the role of private sector? What is the role of bilateral funders? Than focusing on you don't have capacity, so you don't get the money. So that's the narrative that we are trying to change. And also look at scaled up funding that is long-term, that is predictable, that is accessible. Otherwise, LDCs will not be able to fund. And when they get loans, they are struggling with public good services. They already have debts that they are servicing. So adding adaptation loans and contributions does not work for the LDCs. Yeah. Thanks.
So you basically just added another layer of complexity to the conversation, right? It's about the requirements. How can countries meet the requirements to access the funds even when the funds are available? public or private sources. And you emphasize this issue of power dynamics. Andrew, I want to hear a little bit about the role of philanthropy in this conversation, and if you can tell us a little bit more about how the fund is choosing its projects, and specifically, obviously, adaptation projects, and how philanthropy fits in this whole discussion.
Well, I think philanthropy does have a role. I don't entirely agree with your Minister of Environment that says everything should be grants. But it's certainly true that a lot more needs to be grants for adaptation than mitigation. If you think about it for a moment about the private sector, as we said before, the private sector needs to have some kind of cash flow back. Every year that passes, there's more cash coming back for mitigation. The entire marginal abatement cost curve is shifting down as technology improves. So 20 years ago, or 30 years ago, when they created the Global Environment Facility, they needed lots and lots of subsidy for renewable energy. Now you need relatively little. You need a little bit of blended finance. So maybe the share of public money and philanthropy that goes to adaptation needs to rise as technology improves. Now it improves, which is mainly for mitigation. Now, by the way, technology is also improving for adaptation, but not as dramatically. So, for example, I mean, we now can predict weather systems much, much better than before. That's part of making your economy more resilient. And there's certainly money to be made from that if you're in the private sector, or from developing new seeds for that are more drought resistant and so on. So as you were saying, Rania, it depends on the individual sector. Now, for philanthropy, it's true today still that most philanthropy goes to mitigation. There's about $10 billion of philanthropy that's available for mitigation. There's less than that available for adaptation. And I think that's because philanthropy has fallen into the same trap, perhaps, as other funders have, is that actually funding adaptation is more complicated. It's much easier to build a windmill than it is to tweak, 1,000 different small projects at the farm level, say. And so the whole idea of intermediation is important. I'll give you an example that we finance through landscape restoration in Africa, which is about mitigation, but it's also about adaptation. It makes crops more resilient. It makes incomes more resilient. It helps food security. It helps soil moisture, and so on. So, but it turns out that to do landscape restoration in Africa, our money will be spent finally by probably thousands, probably 5,000 different players will spend our money. The problem is we can't give 5,000 grants and monitor them. So the trick is you need to aggregate. You need to have aggregators. And one of the things we're trying to do in landscape restoration, which can be very profitable, by the way, certain kinds, at the local level, driven by communities, we're trying to sort of increase the ratio. At the moment, it's 80% grants and 20% private investment. We want to see if we can reverse that so that the private sector actually is willing to take the risks, but also then gets some of the return as well. I really want to support what Bo Lee said as well about the idea of, some adaptation will pay for itself because it will be your own investment that benefits. Much of it, though, will benefit the group, and we need to be smarter on things like betterment taxes. I mean, your Fiscal Affairs Department has been a leader in this space, and it's interesting that a lot of the climate change work has been led from your Fiscal Affairs Department, and that actually makes a lot of sense because governments really do have a very important role here.
Rania, I want to bring you in here also to react a little bit to what Andrew said. And just on an anecdotal level, you said that your Minister of Environment, indeed, if you speak, they would want to see all this money come from grants. Like, what do you tell them back? And how do you help achieve consensus on this?
Well, the longer we stay, the more costly it's going to be for the economy, for the jobs, and we have to find out ways. But I want to also mention, start where Andrew left off, governments have a role to play. When I'm putting a plan, the projects need to be identified and tagged adaptation, mitigation. There needs to be a conscious decision on prioritization. Certain things can wait, other things need to be expedited. Technology in adaptation plays a huge role. The economies of scale on farming particularly, by using some technology, brings a big stream of revenue for the investor, but also for the community. So there's an impact. If we're doing an impact analysis on the number of individuals, particularly in middle income, emerging, and low income countries, that would benefit from I don't know, $100 of investment with technology, I think that is going to be definitely a bigger return on investment. So the other aspect is, how can we show that it worked in many cases? And we try to put together examples, particularly from Africa, where the private sector has gone into what is labeled as adaptation projects and have been able to make profit. Kenya, there are many examples and so forth. So this also gives an appetite and a showcase that it is possible and it can work. So that's, it's not completely dull or yes or no. There are no corner solutions, corner answers. It's not a binary answer. But showcasing how we can scale successful examples is important. You mentioned, giving examples. We have a very good integrated farming project in Egypt that now is helping farmers with carbon credits. So here you've been able to use an innovative financing tool for mitigation at the farm level with farmers. So there's a monetization. We're also thinking about resilience credits, another way to look at adaptation projects and monetize, so that the private sector can come in with some of the tools as well. So it's a very long conversation. It's also, as Andrew mentioned, the disaster recovery, the temperature, the maps for the countries, the public investment management assessments that the countries need to do, and the climate public investment assessments that the CPIMA and the PIMA that the IMF advocate for countries. So it's a multi-stakeholder dialogue, and that's why we are all here and we are discussing this at COP. And I think year after year, we're getting a little bit better. We're getting better examples, and we are seeing the private sector and philanthropy in the adaptation space in different countries.
That's great. And I want to pick up something you said, but I also want to turn to the audience and let you know that we will take some questions. So if you want to think about your questions. But just boldly to react to something that Rania said, this idea of showcasing the success of adaptation projects. Actually, how do we, and actually for everyone who wants to jump in here, how can we best measure the impact? Because we don't have like one concrete tool to measure the impact of adaptation projects, and they're not really comparable even across countries or regions. So how do we need like a framework for all of this? Is that even possible? How do we measure? How can we showcase it, basically?
Very good question. I don't think we have a simple answer to that. What I can say is that 2 points. One is that even for our RST, we are now trying to figure out how to evaluate the success or the performance of our RST program. So one of the job we will do next is to figure out, one, to track the progress of RST countries in terms of other reform measures and how those reform measures are helping the country build resilience, to help the country to adapt, and also to help the country to mitigate. So we need to develop metric to measure the success or lack of thereof in terms of RST program. So similarly, you talk about how to measure the success of adaptation efforts. Well, I think that's a question probably for the international community to consider, because right now, compared to mitigation, you have a single measure, right? You have, the emission, the CO2 emission. But for adaptation, I think we need a much more nuanced and also much more multidimensional measure or metric to consider. But that's a good question. My second point is that for some area, no matter how much you adapt, the result may be that you may want to say, okay, maybe instead of adapting, maybe we should do something different. Maybe we should just, some city on the sea may disappear in 10 years, 20 years. Maybe we just move away instead of adapting, right? For some small cities, some cities on the sea line, maybe it's easier to just move people away, to instead of adapting, investing in that particular city. So that's a question again, facing cities in the world that may be too big to be answered now in terms of are we moving away or are we adapting now? And that's again should be part of the national planning process. So that's why we're advocating in our paper that adaptation, climate adaptation, should be part of national and sectoral planning process in order to help city administrator to think about the future. What kind of adaptation makes sense because there are different possibilities.
Okay, thank you. Did you want to add something, Andrew, or can we take a question? Okay. Do we have a question from the audience at this moment? Yes, over there and over here. We have someone with a microphone coming around right there, the lady.
Hi, thank you to the panel. I'm Tulika Narayan from Mathematica, and we are in the business of generating evidence on what works and have thought about how to measure resilience. And my question to the panel is that, looking across the information that I'm gathering on financing, just wanted to get your perspective on whether investment and adaptation is less because it is complicated, or you're really finding it hard to find interventions that work, and what is the role of evidence in supporting that, and the distinguishing piece that we need to have on bankable projects for adaptation versus, to your point, the ones that will not be bankable and need adaptation. So I just want to get a sense from you as a funder and IMF and Bezos Earth Fund, to what degree is the lack of evidence an impediment, and to what degree the tepid pipeline is an impediment versus, the complexity, which is also true.
Sure, and I'm also just mindful of time, so if you can keep your answer slightly short.
Number one, it's a wonderful question, and I think we don't fully know the answer. I'll bet you in this building right now, there are 1,000 people that are working for funds for mitigation, private funds for mitigation. How many are in this building in private funds for adaptation? There will be some, but not very many. And you're asking a very good question. Is it because we don't know how to do it and we will learn? Or is it something more fundamental about the lack of cash flow? And I think what we all need to do, exactly as we've been saying, is we need to tweak the system. So philanthropy shouldn't just be putting $1 in and $1 of adaptation out. Philanthropy or concessional funding should put $1 in and get $10 out, because we make it more attractive for the private sector to come in. But I think we're going to have to think more about that. And just one comment on how we measure. 20 years ago or 30 years ago, we didn't know how to measure financial risks in financial institutions. So we invented stress tests, didn't we? And obviously the IMF knows a lot about financial stress tests. We ought to do exactly the same on adaptation. A country should have a stress test. We now have models that can simulate anything, and we actually can show how floods rise, where they'll damage, what buildings. With AI, we could actually do an amazing job on that, and then we would know whether or not countries, cities, industries are resilient. And we will find they're not resilient, and that will attract more money.
Thank you. We have time for one final question. I know your hand was up here.
Hello, thank you very much. My name is Mohammed Usman. I'm from Somalia. Without taking much time, I'm going direct to the question. The question is, the discussion brought out a notion that was in my mind. When it comes to Somalia's context, private sector play a very big role, even more better than the government sometimes when it comes to that context. So, and when it comes to the trust between the government and the private sector is very low. So my question goes to the panel is that how do we instill trust to the private sectors in the resilience building? That's the first question. The second question is how do we incorporate the private sector's engagement into the national planning? Thank you very much.
So trust and how to incorporate it into national planning.
I think it's very important that the government does not crowd out the private sector, but puts the minimum amount of public investment required to make the investment worthwhile. So that's why if we're doing country platforms, which are investment plans, for example, in our case, we've identified that these are the priority projects. This is the minimum we will do in terms of publicly, so that we can bring in the private sector. The other thing is to do all the regulatory reforms required. For example, we changed the water law to allow private sector to be able to be engaged in the water sector, for instance, one of the very regulated sectors. So there's a process of deregulation, which is important. There's a process of creating more competitiveness for the private sector to come in, which is important. And also being mindful when you're designing these reforms that you are addressing what Andrew needs to be able to come in the country and implement or invest with the money. So that definitely government should be a building block in creating the environment and putting the minimum, and trying to work with the international partners to bring in the concessional that will be leveraged going forward. So these are all pieces or pillars that the government needs to work on.
Okay, thank you so much. And I'm aware there's more questions, but we are out of time right now. So I would like to thank all the panelists and thank you also for joining us.